Hi there, I'm Carl Soule, and for today we are going to be talking about turnover-based workflows using Adobe Premiere, particularly turning over for sound or turning over for color. It's important to kind of understand the overall aspects of the workflow. A lot of the information that I'm about to present here is actually available inside of the Best Practices Guide for Film and Television, which is an online PDF that you can download. It's over 100 pages worth of really amazing information about all aspects of the production process. Something I'm not going to get too deep into today is some of the work that this is built upon using Dailies-based workflows. If you are shooting second system audio, if you're dealing with you're recording audio independent of the video, or you're using a better quality audio recorder and that's replacing what the camera is hearing. There are some other videos that cover multicam and how to use multicam for that purpose. Again, I want to stress we do not recommend using the merged clips feature in Premiere when it comes to turnover-based workflows, because a lot of metadata information actually gets lost using a merged clips-based workflow. There are some workarounds. There's some ways of kind of round-tripping XML if you get into that situation. But what I'm going to show you here today is how simple it is if you've already used multicam or if you've managed your audio and video independently, which is kind of what I'm going to be showcasing here. This particular short film that I'm going to be using to demonstrate this has audio is actually separate because the audio is more built in post-production using sound effects, Foley, as well as kind of a voiceover narration. But we still need to be able to do a final sound mix and be able to turn this over to somebody using another application such as Pro Tools. So we want to make sure that we've got everything set up correctly. Now, a couple of things to think about. If you are actively working on a film and you're getting ready to do a turnover, it's not a bad idea to duplicate that sequence and maybe move it into a separate project. If you're working on something like a feature film, it's not uncommon to say, okay, we're going to turn things over at noon, but at 1 o'clock after lunch, the lead editor needs to be able to get into that reel and begin making additional modifications and tweaks to it. So an easy way of ensuring that is at noon to just create a new project inside of your production and copy that sequence over into that turnover project. This also gives an assistant editor the ability to kind of go in and sort of reorganize stuff, double check that everything is where it's supposed to be. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is move this sequence, not going to move it, I'm going to copy it over into a different project. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the sequence in the bin here and I'm going to drag it up to this other project tab here. And now holding down the command key on my Mac, this would be the control key on a Windows machine, you'll see that the little plus has shown up next to my cursor. And now when I let go, you can see this has now made a copy. So the original sequence is here. The turnover sequence is here. I might do something to distinguish these two, like put, a date or a time. I'm just going to write noon turnover on this one, but I might actually use month, day, year, time code, something to distinguish to make sure that I'm aware of when this turnover happened. The other thing I'm going to also do is make sure that the original sequence, I'm going to close that because I'm actually going to be going through and making some changes to this sequence to organize it properly. What I mean by that, first off, you should be using sequences in this type of workflow. If you know you have turnovers coming, it is always a good idea to organize your tracks and name your tracks. If you do this, a lot of the work in passing this over to your sound mixer, they will love you for it. If you don't do it, they won't love you. So in this case, you'll notice that I have 2 tracks listed for voiceover, a single track for music, which is unusual. Most of the time I would have more than a single track labeled like music 1, music 2. And then you'll see that the sound effects for this, because all the sound is being generated as kind of Foley sound, they're all based on sound effects. There was no natural sound recorded. I've got all of these different sound effects tracks listed here. One easy way to tell if things are in the right place When you're organizing your project, and we cover this in the best practices guide, if you use color labels on the different types of audio, you'll be able to see at a glance if clips are in the right location. What I mean by this is if I right click on this clip here that's kind of this yellow color, and I go to Label, select Label Group, this will show, it will highlight all of the clips that are in that group within the sequence. So if a clip is on the wrong track, it makes it much easier to see where that clip happens to be and be able to move it to an appropriate sound effects track. Now, the other thing to also consider when you're working with Premiere and you have to go to an application like Pro Tools is how the other application is going to be able to handle stereo and mono content on a single track. Premiere is somewhat unique in the industry in that we have this concept of a standard track. And what I mean by that is a standard track can have both mono content, which is center panned, and stereo content, which is going to play back as left-right, can exist on the same track in the timeline. Turns out a lot of applications, such as Pro Tools, really don't like that. And when it comes time to do a turnover, if you leave your stereo and mono content on the same track, what is one track in Premiere will turn into 3 tracks when you bring it over into Pro Tools. You'll end up with a stereo left, stereo right, and a mono track all broken out separately. And this can start to look very disorganized. So as part of the prep work, if you have mixed mono and stereo sound effects, it might be a good idea to create some mono tracks and move the mono content to mono tracks, and then move the stereo content to separate stereo tracks. I'll give you an example of this here in my timeline. So I'm just going to go ahead and expand out these voiceover tracks here a little bit. And I'll go ahead and zoom into some different sections of the timeline here so that we can see this. So you can see here, I've got in a couple of places here, I've got some voiceover tracks that are stereo. They were recorded using a stereo microphone. I've got other voiceover tracks that were recorded using a mono microphone. And I can tell that based on the fact that, you know, this clip has 2 waveforms stacked on top of each other. This one has a single waveform at the bottom. So this is a case where having a voiceover mono track might be a good idea. And so in this situation, as part of my prep work for the turnover, I may add a track and make sure and add a mono track. So right here, I'm going to say I don't want any video tracks, but I do want an audio track after voiceover 2, and I want this to be a mono track. And no submix tracks. We're not going to get into submixing today. Don't typically use submixing if you have to turn things over. They're great for delivery inside of Premiere. They break a lot of turnover-based workflows. So just wanted to call that out. Okay, so this looks pretty correct. 1 audio track after VO2, and we're calling it mono. I'll go ahead and click OK. And so now I have this extra track here, and I can go ahead and label this VO space 3 mono. Now, once I do this, now I'm going to start the whole process of moving some of the mono content and get all the mono content onto that mono track. So like this clip that's currently in VO1, I'm going to select it, hold down the shift key as I drag it down. That will ensure that it's not moving left or right in time. It will preserve the edit. And I might want to do that to this clip here. Again, hold down the shift key, drag it down. Grab this clip, hold down the shift key, drag it down. There's some additional little bits and pieces that you're probably seeing here in my timeline. I'm not going to do this to everything, just to quickly give you a sense as to where some of these are living. I see that this one actually has 2 pieces, and this might actually overlap slightly, or I might have just selected, yeah, I selected 2 clips and it accidentally moved one down an extra track. So I'm just going to bring that one back up there. So you see what I'm doing here is I'm now moving these away from VO1 and VO2, which are standard tracks. I'm just going to leave the standard tracks to handle stereo content. This new mono track is going to be where all my mono content lives. If you do a lot of this and you find that, your editor, the lead editor, needs to have everything be standard because they want to be able to put everything anywhere, they don't really need to want to have to worry about whether it's stereo or mono, that's fine. Have them edit in a sequence that has everything, as standard tracks. But when it comes time to actually do your turnovers, you might want to look at creating a sequence preset that mimics the same order of tracks, but uses mono tracks for if all of your voiceovers are mono, you might as well create a sequence preset that uses mono. And that way, instead of having to move stuff around, you can simply take stuff and copy it and paste it into the new sequence, and everything will be on the correct type of track at that point. Another way of kind of thinking about this, but separating out the mono and the stereo content is kind of a good thing. It really makes sure that everything is organized. And again, putting voiceovers in one set of tracks, music in another set of tracks, sound effects, ambience, separating them out by type will make your sound engineer very, very happy. As far as exporting this out, once you have everything kind of dialed in and you've got everything set up the way that you need this to go out, the way to export out, we typically recommend the AAF format. AAF is the export format of choice for going to tools like Pro Tools. Now, I'm sure there's some of you who are saying, oh, no, we use OMF here. OMF is an option. I just want to let you know, OMF is what we like to call in the business a deprecated format. What that means is there is no development going on that front. That's not an Adobe decision that made that. The owners of the OMF format have basically told us, don't use OMF anymore, use AAF. AAF supersedes OMF. If your OMF workflow is working for you, that's fine, then more power to you. But just know that AAF is where development is continuing to go. New fixes and things are going into the AAF format. New improvements to the workflows. You're not going to see that in OMF, just to understand that. So I'm going to choose to go out AAF. And typically the way the AAF exporter works is there's really kind of 2 exporters built into one panel here. If I leave this breakout to mono box unchecked, I'm creating an AAF file that's designed for editorial use. It'll go to an application like Media Composer. What you're probably going to want to do is make something that's more akin for Pro Tools or other applications that use AAF for audio, in which case you're going to want to enable this checkbox here. From here, there's a couple of different options that are available to you. First off, these first 2 checkboxes underneath the enable box, if I turn this one on, this will bake in any audio clip effects that I currently have in the timeline. And this second box will include clip copies without the effects in separate tracks. So by turning these 2 on, you're effectively doubling the number of tracks that you want. Talk to your sound engineer about this. There's no right or wrong answer as to what to check here. I do find most sound engineers just prefer to get the unaltered clips without any intent. Maybe send them a mix of the overall project in addition to this, but for the most part, just check the enable checkbox here. As far as format is concerned, we really recommend broadcast wave. It's much more of a standard than AIFF going out to sound mixing tools. Unless you are specifically being told to use AIFF, I would just default to broadcast wave. And then there's this option here as far as embedding the audio or bringing separate audio. Embedding is going to make a very big AAF file because all of your individual sound bits are going to be actually inside that AAF file. If you're working with most sound engineers, we usually recommend using the separate audio option because in doing so, this is just going to make sure that more metadata is preserved. And by the way, if you are using the multicam workflow that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, you don't have to flatten anything ahead of time. the AAF exporter will actually do the flattening for you. So that's another extra step to that it avoids, that it really, really helps out. But by choosing separate audio, it just ensures that all the metadata from the original source files end up in the rendered audio for the AAF file. And it makes it much easier if the Pro Tools artist needs to relink to the original sound rolls for some reason, such as adding in microphones that were unused in your mix. They can use a feature in Pro Tools that will enable that workflow. If they're not familiar with it, there's something called field recorder guide tracks, where you can specify a track in an AAF that's been imported as a guide track and attach the original sound rolls based on timecode information and other metadata information. So there is actually a fairly easy way for the sound engineer to bring in the microphones on their end rather than cutting them in Premiere. Just to be aware of it, it does exist. All right, so that is a lot of the basics of how you would typically do an audio-based turnover. If you're turning over for color or for other types of formats, there are some additional export options that are available to you. Final Cut Pro XML, this XML format is very well established in the industry. The biggest gotcha with this that I always warn people about is make sure that your sequence is selected either here or over in the bin here when you do your export, because otherwise Premiere will create an XML of the entire project. That tends to break a lot of workflows. A lot of tools out there like Resolve do not like an XML of the project, but they love an XML of the sequence. So that's something to consider. Using XML-based workflows, you may have to do a bit of cleanup of the video. XML supports multiple tracks. It supports a lot of bass properties. But if you're using a lot of effects or transitions, you might actually want to clean those off of your sequence. And there is actually a menu choice under sequence called Simplify Sequence, which can be a very useful tool for helping to kind of clean things up in your sequence, where you can remove markers, you can remove empty tracks, any graphics, transitions, disabled clips, things like that. This is something to be aware of as a nice tool when you're doing these types of turnovers. Again, in most cases, there is some sequence prep that you need to do before you do your turnover, and this can definitely help with that. The other option for export for turnover-based workflows are EDLs. EDLs are as simple as they get. I think this is a format that hasn't fundamentally changed since the 1970s. And it's basically a text-based file that is called an edit decision list. And it's, for the most part, the file with a little bit of header information. It's mostly time code of where the source, what part of a source clip you need, and where that goes on the timeline. Very, very basic. In fact, in most cases, there's single video track only. So if you have many video tracks, you either need to flatten everything down as much as possible and then export multiple EDLs for each of the video tracks that you have that you're working with. Audio is similar. I think you're limited to about 4 tracks. And you'll notice that there are a bunch of different checkboxes up here at the top. Depending on where you're exporting to, I always recommend doing a turnover test in the early days of Dailies, both for audio and for anything like color, final conform, any other types of turnovers, because in some cases, particularly with EDLs, you may want to have some of these checkboxes turned on and some of them turned off. Which ones will work for you are going to depend on who your finishing house is. And because of that, I don't have any right or wrong answers as far as which checkboxes to turn on here. It really does depend on doing some tests, trying a few different options with some different checkboxes turned on. The biggest thing I can recommend is when you send somebody an EDL, take a screenshot of this panel, and with all the different checkboxes that you have turned on, they may have some specific requirements that they may come back to you. For example, some color grading tools use EDLs that actually have the LUT names and the CDL information baked into them. That can be in an EDL file. If this is turned on for some applications, it will make an invalid EDL. They won't know what to do with this data, and it'll break the workflow. Other tools I think Baselight in particular uses this functionality. So if you're going out to Baselight for color, this would be an example of where you might want to include the CDL and LUT information. So just check with the company that's doing the finishing. Maybe send them a couple of different options and they'll tell you, oh, that one worked, these other two didn't. Now you know what direction you need to go to moving forward. Again, just a quick overview of turnover-based workflows. Thank you so much for watching.